The road to Rome was not blocked by an army, it was blocked by a hill, one German major, 150 men inside walls that nothing could crack. On the morning of June 9th, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Burton Graves stood at the bottom of that hill and looked up at something that had already killed 2,800 men in 23 days. He had a map in his left hand, a cold cup of coffee in his right, and absolutely no idea what to do next. The hill had a name on the military maps, elevation 973. But the men who had tried to take it stopped calling it by its number after the first week. They called it Devil's Tooth, because from the valley below in the early morning light, it rose out of the Italian earth like a fang, sharp, grey, patient, the kind of thing that does not move and does not care how many times you throw yourself against it. Inside that hill, behind 3 feet of reinforced concrete, Major Ernst Brandt had been waiting. He was 41 years old. He had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, which meant he had survived things that most men cannot imagine and certainly cannot describe. He had fought in snow so deep it buried tanks. He had fought in cold so brutal that rifle bolts froze solid in the night. He had watched entire divisions disappear into the Russian earth like they had never existed. And he had come out the other side of all of it with something most men lose in their first winter of real war. He had come out of it with patience. Brandt did not panic. Brandt did not rush. He looked at every position the way a chess player looks at the board, not just the piece directly in front of him, but the whole game, 3 moves ahead. When he was assigned to Devil's Tooth in May of 1944, he did not see a hill. He saw a position, and he spent 3 weeks turning that position into something that could not be taken. His bunkers had walls 3 feet thick. His machine guns covered every path up the slope. He had buried mines in the road on the southern approach and wired the northern trail with trip flares. He had food for 2 months and ammunition for considerably longer. He had ranged every open piece of ground within 500 yards and noted the exact number of seconds it would take a charging man to cross each one. He had thought of everything, or so he believed. The first American attack came on May the 17th. 200 infantry soldiers moved up the main path at dawn, spread wide, moving fast. Brandt's machine gunners had been waiting since before sunrise. 80 men went down in the first 4 minutes. The rest pulled back, dragging their wounded through the dirt. The second attack came 4 days later. This time the Americans brought armor. 4 M4 Sherman tanks rumbling up the southern road, their engines loud enough to be heard from the valley below. Brandt watched them come from his observation slit. The mines he had buried in that road 3 weeks earlier had been placed at precisely the intervals a cautious tank commander would choose for spacing. The first Sherman hit a mine at the first bend, then the second, then the third. The fourth tank stopped, reversed, and did not come back. The third attack was the one that should have worked. American artillery opened up on the morning of June 3rd and did not stop for 6 hours. 1,200 shells. The noise shook loose stones from the cliff faces on the surrounding hills. It turned the slope below Brandt's position into a moonscape of craters and smoke. When it finally stopped and the dust began to clear, American forward observers trained their binoculars on the hill and looked for the German flag. It was still there. The concrete had not cracked. The bunkers had not shifted. 3 feet of reinforced concrete, built by men who had spent years constructing fortifications across half of Europe, had absorbed everything the American artillery could offer and asked for more. After the third attack, Graves sat in his tent with 3 officers and a topographical map and said nothing for a very long time. 340 American casualties, not one German bunker taken. The road to Rome still closed. Every day that hill held, the entire Italian campaign slowed. Graves needed an answer. He did not have one. What he had instead, sitting quietly at the edge of the briefing that evening, not speaking unless spoken to, was a 26-year-old sergeant named Eli Stonepath. Stonepath was not easy to notice in a room full of officers. He was not the tallest man, he was not the loudest, he did not wear his service record on his face the way some men do. That particular expression of someone who needs you to know what they have seen and done. He sat with his back straight and his hands on his knees and his dark eyes moving slowly across the topographical map pinned to the board at the front of the tent. He was Apache. He had grown up in the mountains of eastern Arizona, in a place where the elevation changes so dramatically over such a short distance that a man can walk from desert floor to pine forest in half a day. He had learned to climb before he learned to read. His grandfather had taught him on the rock faces above the family land, not as sport, not as training, but as necessity. In that country, if you could not move through vertical terrain, you could not reach your herds, could not track game, could not do the things that life required. He had joined the army in 1941 at age 23 and had been in long enough to understand one thing with complete clarity. Most officers looked at terrain and saw obstacles. Eli Stonepath looked at terrain and saw options. He did not say anything that evening at the briefing. He looked at the map. He noted the elevation lines on the rear face of Devil's Tooth, the side that faced away from the valley, away from the American lines, the side no attack had ever considered. He noted the way those lines were spaced. He read the cliff face the way his grandfather had taught him, not as a barrier but as a problem with a solution that hadn't been found yet. That night, he did not sleep. The following morning, while the rest of the battalion prepared for what Graves was already calling a fourth approach, Stonepath slipped away before sunrise. He carried no weapon beyond his service knife. He told no one where he was going. He walked 3 miles around the base of the hill, staying low, staying in the shadow of the tree line, moving with the quiet discipline of a man who learned long ago that silence is not the absence of sound, but the practice of it. He reached the rear face of Devil's Tooth as the sun came up. He stood at the base and looked up for a long time. The cliff rose 400 feet of grey limestone, ancient and seamed with thin cracks and narrow ledges. It was not smooth. No cliff face is ever truly smooth to a man who knows how to read stone, but it was severe. The angle was steep. The holds were small. To anyone looking up from below, it was a wall. Nobody had put guards on it. Stonepath spent 20 minutes at the base just reading the rock, then he started to climb. He moved without ropes, without equipment, with nothing but his hands and the boots on his feet. He tested every hold before he weighted it. He found the seams in the limestone that were invisible from below and followed them upward, not always in a straight line, not always the obvious way, but always moving, always finding the next thing to grip and the next place to stand. At 280 feet, he found the ledge. 15 feet wide, the rock flat enough to stand on without bracing. A slight overhang above meant it could not be seen from the German positions at the top of the cliff. He stood on that ledge and looked down at the valley floor far below, then looked up at the remaining 120 feet of cliff above him. He could hear, faintly, the sound of German voices from somewhere over the rim of rock. He stood there for 2 full minutes, working through the arithmetic in his head. Then he climbed back down. He went straight to Graves and laid it out simply. The rear cliff had no guards. There was a concealed ledge at 280 feet. If 60 men could climb to that ledge before dawn and hold position, they would be directly behind the German bunkers at first light, inside the fortress that Brandt had built to face the other direction, his machine guns, his mines, his carefully ranged fields of fire, all of it pointed the wrong way. Graves listened. Then he shook his head. "That cliff cannot be climbed at night," he said. "Not by 60 men carrying full equipment. Even if your people could do it, they would be carrying 40 pounds of gear each. Their rifles alone weigh 10 pounds. If they make any sound at all, any sound, but the Germans will hear it and shoot every last one of them off that rock face. I won't authorize a suicide mission." Stonepath did not argue. He simply asked for 48 hours. Graves gave him 24 and clearly expected nothing to come of it. That night, Stonepath returned to the cliff with 2 men from his unit, Private First Class Harmon Tallbear, 24 years old, Navajo, who had grown up in canyon country and could climb anything that could be climbed, and Corporal Destin Runningwater, 22, Cherokee, the quietest human being Stonepath had ever known, a man whose ability to move through any terrain without a sound was something that had to be witnessed to be believed. The 3 of them climbed the cliff in total darkness. They reached the ledge in 2 hours and 15 minutes. They came back down without making a sound. The next morning, Stonepath presented himself at brigade headquarters and made his case a second time in front of Graves and 2 senior officers whose names he had not been given. He explained what he and his men had done the previous night. He explained the ledge. He explained the concealment. He explained what would happen when 60 men appeared at dawn behind fortifications designed to face only one direction. One of the unnamed officers cut him off before he finished. "This is modern warfare, Sergeant," the man said. "We don't win ground with knives and rock climbing. We win with firepower and armor. I appreciate the effort, but the answer is no." Stonepath stood at attention and said, "Yes, sir." He walked out of the headquarters tent and did not allow his face to change. Behind him, Captain Wendell Forsyth, the artillery observer who had watched all 3 failed attacks from a forward position, who had called in the shells and watched them bounce off concrete, was already reaching for his jacket. Forsyth had a friend on the division staff, not a close friend, but close enough. On the evening of June 12th, a sealed order arrived at Graves's headquarters. It authorized 1 attempt, 1 night, 60 men, no armor support, no artillery preparation. If it failed, the army would proceed with conventional planning and the words "rear cliff" would never be spoken again. Graves found Stonepath and handed him the paper without a word. Stonepath read it once, folded it, put it in his pocket. That evening he gathered his 60 men in a dry creek bed 300 yards behind the American line. They sat in a rough circle in the last light of the day and looked at him, Apache, Navajo, Cherokee, men who had grown up in country that looked something like this hill but harder, in terrain that had been teaching their families to move through vertical rock for generations before any of them were born. They had been trained by the army, but shaped by something older. Stonepath did not make a speech. He did not talk about the war or the stakes or what it would mean if they succeeded. He said, "We have 2 nights to practice on the southern cliff. Then we do it for real on the night of the 13th. The ledge is at 280 feet. I've been there twice. I know the way. You follow me, you do what I do, and you do not make a sound. That's all." One of the men asked if it was possible. Stonepath looked at him for a moment. "I've already done it twice," he said. "Now we do it with 60. Nobody said anything after that. The light went the rest of the way down and the stars came out over the Italian hills, and 60 men sat in the dark and held everything they had inside themselves and waited. Above them, somewhere beyond the dark shape of the cliff they could not yet see, Ernst Brandt was eating dinner and watching his guards make their rounds and believing with complete certainty that he had thought of everything. He had not thought of Eli Stonepath. He had not thought about what a man who learned to climb before he learned to read could see in a cliff face that no one else had bothered to look at. That lesson was coming. It was coming in 2 nights. And it was coming on quiet feet in the dark, 400 feet straight up the one side of Devil's Tooth that nobody had been watching. They spent 2 nights on a different cliff. 2 miles south of Devil's Tooth, hidden behind a ridge that kept them out of German observation, There was a limestone face that rose 350 feet out of a dry riverbed. It was not the same cliff. The rock was softer, the angle slightly less severe, the holds a little more generous. But it was close enough, and it was all they had. The first night, 12 men did not make it past 150 feet, not because they fell, not because they lacked strength, because they made noise, a rifle strap against stone, a boot scraping loose a pebble, the small involuntary sounds that a body makes when it is working at its absolute limit in the dark, and the mind has not yet learned to control everything at once. Stonepath brought them all back down before midnight and said nothing. He sat at the base of the cliff for an hour afterward, alone, looking up at the rock face in the dark, and thought. The second night, all 60 men made it to 250 feet. It took 4 hours. It should have taken 2, but they were quieter. The strap problem had been solved with strips of cloth cut from undershirts and wound around every piece of metal that could move or catch or ring. Buttons checked, buckles taped, canteens packed tight so water did not slosh. Every man had gone through his own equipment in the dark with his hands, feeling for anything that could speak when it was not supposed to. By the time they reached 250 feet on that second practice night, Stonepath had what he needed, not perfection. You do not get perfection from 60 men on a cliff face at night. What he had was something better than perfection. 60 men who understood exactly what was required of them and had decided, in the private way that soldiers decide things, that they were going to do it. On the afternoon of June 13th, Stonepath walked through his men one by one. He did not inspect their equipment. He looked at their faces, not for fear. Fear was not the problem. Fear keeps a man careful, fear keeps a man quiet. What he was checking for was something harder to name, the particular exhaustion that settles behind a man's eyes when he has decided, somewhere below conscious thought, that he is already dead. He had seen that look once before, in a man in Sicily who had walked into German fire with the calm of someone walking to a mailbox. That man's face had told the story the morning before it happened. None of his 60 men had that look. What they had was the focused stillness of men who have accepted that the next few hours will require everything they possess and have already made peace with that requirement. At 2300, Captain Forsyth appeared at the edge of camp. He did not say much. He shook Stonepath's hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake requires. Then he stepped back into the dark and let them go. At 23:47, Stonepath stepped up to the base of Devil's Tooth. The night was cold, the deep, sharp cold of an Italian June at elevation, the kind that gets into the fingers and stiffens them slowly over hours without announcing itself until the damage is already done. The temperature was around 8 degrees below zero. The rock under his fingertips felt like iron. He found the first hold, tested it, weighted it, moved. 30 seconds behind him, the second man started up, then the third, then the fourth, and the trees. One by one, at 30-second intervals, all 60 men began moving up the face of Devil's Tooth in total darkness. Above them, no more than 300 feet away, German soldiers were sleeping, playing cards, eating late dinners out of tin cans, doing the things that soldiers do at midnight when they believe themselves completely safe. Stonepath moved with the unhurried precision of a man following a route his body already knows. He had climbed this cliff 3 times. He knew where the good holds were and where the rock became unreliable around the 180-foot mark. He knew the leftward traverse at 200 feet that looked wrong but was the only way through a blank section. He knew the route not through memory, but through something deeper. The knowledge that lives in muscle and bone rather than in the thinking mind. His hands were cold but working. His shoulders carried 43 pounds of equipment. He did not think about the weight. He did not think about what was above him or below him. He thought about the next hold, and then the next, and then the one after that. At 100 feet, he stopped and listened. He could hear breathing below him, faint and controlled. He could hear cloth moving against stone. He could not hear boots scraping. He could not hear equipment rattling. His men were doing exactly what they had trained to do. He moved on. At 180 feet, someone's canteen touched the rock wall. The sound was small, a dull metallic tap, half swallowed by the night air. Not loud, not the kind of sound that carries far under normal circumstances, but in the silence surrounding that cliff face, the deep country silence of an Italian hillside at midnight, with no wind and no vehicles and no artillery, it was enough. Every man on the cliff stopped moving. 60 men hung in the dark on a limestone face in absolute stillness. Nobody breathed more than necessary. Nobody shifted their weight. Nobody looked up or down. They had drilled for this exact moment. When something goes wrong, you stop. You become part of the rock. You wait. Above them, the German position was quiet. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. Stonepath counted his own heartbeats. He was at 190 feet, pressed flat against the rock, left hand locked into a horizontal crack, right foot on a ledge the width of a boot heel. He could feel the cold of the stone through his jacket. He kept his breathing shallow and his body absolutely still, and he waited with the patience of a man for whom patience has never been a virtue, but simply a way of surviving. At 4 minutes and 11 seconds, no lights had come on above. No voices had been raised, no boots had moved to the edge of the cliff. Stonepath gave the signal. 3 slow taps on the rock face that traveled through vibration rather than sound. The column began to move again. What none of them knew was the full story behind that silence from above. Major Brandt had not been careless. He had read the intelligence reports on Native American soldiers serving with American infantry units in the Mediterranean theater. He had noted, with the methodical attention he gave to all information, references to the documented ability of certain Apache and Navajo soldiers to move through difficult terrain at night with a quietness that conventional reconnaissance could not match. He had considered whether his rear cliff required a guard. He had assigned one, Private Werner Aust, 20 years old, from a small town outside Munich. Brandt had ordered him to take position on a rock shelf approximately 60 feet below the lip of the rear cliff and watch for movement. Aust had been on duty since 2200 hours. By midnight, he had been awake for 18 consecutive hours. He had fought to stay alert, sitting straight, shifting position, staring into the darkness below with the strained focus of a man trying to see through a blindfold. But the body has limits that willpower cannot negotiate indefinitely. By 23:30, Werner Aust was losing. By the time Stonepath's column passed the 250-foot mark, Werner Aust was asleep. Tucked against the rock face with his rifle across his knees, his chin dropping toward his chest, in the slow surrender of a body that has run out of resources. His position was invisible from below. His breathing was steady and deep. He was 15 feet to the left of the main route. Stonepath saw him at 310 feet. He stopped so suddenly that the man below almost stepped on his heels. He pressed himself flat against the rock and held completely still, reading the shape he could barely make out in the darkness. The outline of a helmeted head, the dull gleam of a rifle barrel, the slow rise and fall of a sleeping man's chest. He stayed still for 30 full seconds, thinking clearly and quickly through what this meant. If the man woke, they were all dead, not some of them, not most of them, all 60 men on that cliff face, with nowhere to go but down. Stonepath did not look back at the column. He could not explain what he was about to do and could not wait for anyone's approval and could not spend the time it would take to think through alternatives. He pressed one flat palm back against the rock, the signal to stop and hold, and then he began moving sideways. What followed was 11 minutes. He moved laterally across the cliff face in total darkness, covering 20 feet of horizontal distance at 310 feet of elevation in order to pass on the far side of where Werner Aust was sleeping. The rock in this section was less predictable than the main route. The holds were smaller. In 2 places there was nothing for his feet, and he supported himself entirely on his hands for spans of 4 and 5 seconds. He did not rush. Rushing makes noise. Rushing makes mistakes. He moved with the slowness of someone who understands that speed and survival are not always on the same side. The closest he came to Werner Aust was 3 feet. At 3 feet, in silence, you can hear a man breathe. Stonepath heard him breathe. He moved past. He found the route again on the far side and regained it. He waited, pressed against the rock, until his hands stopped doing what hands do when adrenaline has been running hard for too long. Then he signaled the column forward. One by one, 60 men moved past the sleeping German in the dark. Not one of them woke Werner Aust. At 2:23 in the morning, Corporal Destin Runningwater Bewastor, the last man in the column, 22 years old, Cherokee, the quietest human being Stonepath had ever known, pulled himself over the lip of the concealed ledge and lay flat on the limestone. 2 hours and 36 minutes. 60 men, 400 feet, no ropes, no light, no sound that had reached German ears. Stonepath looked at his men spread across the 15-foot ledge and counted them in the dark. All 60. He looked at his hands. The cold had worked deep into his fingers, and they ached in the way that means the pain gets worse when warmth returns. He opened and closed them slowly, bringing the feeling back. Then he lay down on his back on the cold limestone and looked up at the sky above the overhang. Stars, dense and close, the way they are only in places where the darkness is still allowed to be fully dark. He had seen skies like this above the mountains in Arizona, lying on his back as a boy after a long day climbing with his grandfather, every muscle spent and the stones still warm from the afternoon sun beneath him. His grandfather's voice came to him clearly. "The mountain is not against you," the old man had said. Every time they climbed, from the time Stonepath was 7 years old, right up until the last climb they made together, it is only asking whether you are worthy, and the answer is not something you say. It is something you do. Above the ledge, 50 yards away on the other side of the cliff's rim, he could hear the German position beginning its early morning, a voice saying something he could not make out, the scrape of a boot on concrete, the distant smell of coffee drifting down through the still air. The men lying around him were quiet. Some had their eyes open, watching the rim above. Some had closed them. Harman Tallbear sat with his back against the rock and his rifle across his knees, looking at nothing with the patient expression of a man who has made his decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. They had done the impossible part. They had climbed an unclimbable cliff at night, in the cold, in complete silence, carrying everything the army required them to carry, past a German guard who never knew they were there. Now came the part that no amount of training fully prepares a man for. Now they waited for the light. On a limestone ledge 15 feet wide and 280 feet above the valley floor, 60 men lay still and breathed and held everything inside themselves and watched the darkness above them begin, very slowly, to change. The sky changed the way all important things change, not all at once, not with any announcement. Just a slow, almost imperceptible shift at the eastern edge of the world. Black becoming dark blue becoming grey, the particular grey that exists only in the 20 minutes before dawn when the night is leaving but has not yet gone. Stonepath had not slept. He had lain on his back on the limestone ledge and watched the stars fade one by one and listened to the sounds of the German position above him with the focused attention of a man using every sense to build a picture of something he cannot yet see. A voice here, boots there, a metal door on a hinge, the smell of food. The particular rhythm of a position that believes itself completely safe. Men moving without urgency, without the compressed alertness that comes when danger is near, without any of the small behavioral changes that occur when soldiers know they are being watched. They did not know. He sat up slowly at 4:30 and looked at his men. Most were already awake. The ones who had managed to sleep had been pulled out of it by the cold or by the simple biological knowledge that something was coming. They looked at him across the narrow ledge, and he looked back at them, and nothing needed to be said. They had all arrived at the same moment together. Harmon Tallbear was already running his fingers over his rifle action in the dark. Not because it needed checking, but because the hands need to be doing something useful when everything else is waiting. Corporal Destin Runningwater sat completely still, with his eyes open, watching the rim of the ledge above them with the focused stillness of a man who has already put everything unnecessary aside. Stonepath checked his knife. The blade was exactly where it always was. At 4:47, the sky was the color of ash. Not light, not dark. The ambiguous hour when shapes become visible, but details do not. When a man can see that something is there but not yet what it is. The limestone around them had resolved out of pure darkness into texture, the grain of the rock visible now, the cracks and ledges that had been invisible all night, now showing themselves in the flat, early light. Stonepath heard the boots before he saw the man, a single set of footsteps, unhurried, the footsteps of someone doing a routine thing at a routine hour, moving toward the edge of the cliff above them, for the same reason that men have been walking to the edges of things since the beginning of human time, the footsteps of a man who has just pulled himself out of a warm bunk and is not yet fully inside his own day. The German soldier appeared at the rim of the cliff, directly above the ledge. He was young, still carrying the softness of someone the war had not yet fully reshaped. He was in mid-yawn as he reached the edge, a wide, unself-conscious yawn, and he looked out at the valley below with the unfocused gaze of someone who is not really looking at anything. Then he looked down. The yawn stopped. His face did what faces do when the brain receives information it has no prepared response for. A kind of blank freezing. The expression of a system that is processing too many things at once. He stared down at the ledge, at the 60 men lying and sitting on it. At 60, faces looking back up at him in the grey morning light. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Stonepath moved first. He stood in one slow, deliberate motion. Not fast, not aggressive, but with the particular quality of someone whose decision is already complete and fully inhabited. He reached to his belt, drew his knife, raised it above his head where the young German could see it clearly against the pale sky. The blade caught the first thin edge of morning light and held it. The German soldier looked at the knife. He looked at Stonepath's face. He looked back at the knife. He closed his mouth. He turned around. He walked back toward the bunkers with the fast, controlled walk of a man exercising very deliberate restraint over the speed of his own feet. Stonepath watched him go. Then he sat back down on the ledge and waited. What he could hear over the next 2 minutes told him everything. Voices rising, boots moving quickly on concrete, a door opening and not closing, then another voice, closer to the edge, authoritative, measured, asking questions and receiving answers. Someone was in charge up there, and he was being told something that required decisions to be made quickly and carefully. At 4:52, Major Ernst Brandt walked to the edge of the cliff. He was fully dressed. His uniform was correct. His posture was the posture of a man who had been awake for some time already, not because something had woken him, but because he was the kind of officer who rose before his men and spent the early hours doing the quiet work of command. He had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front by being the kind of man who thinks while others sleep. He looked down at the ledge for a long time without speaking. Stonepath watched him process it. He could see the sequence running behind Brandt's eyes. The cliff, the men on the ledge, the equipment they carried, the arithmetic of how long it would have taken 60 men to climb 400 feet in darkness, the realization arriving with slow, irresistible weight that every assumption he had built his defense upon had just been quietly dismantled in the night. Brandt was not afraid. What he was carrying was something more complicated than fear. He was recalculating. When he spoke, his English was careful and precise. The English of a man who learned it formally rather than lived in it, but entirely clear. "You have climbed well," he said. His voice carried easily in the still morning air. "I acknowledge what you have done, but your position is not tenable. You cannot come up under our fire. You cannot remain where you are indefinitely. Surrender now, identify your unit, and you will receive full protections under the Geneva Convention. You have my word as an officer." He stopped and waited. Stonepath looked up at him for a long moment. Then he reached to his belt, drew his knife for the second time, raised it above his head, slowly, with complete calm and complete finality. And then, without any signal, without any order, without a single word, 59 men stood up behind him. 59 knives came out of 59 leather sheaths. The sound those 60 blades made leaving their scabbards simultaneously was not a loud sound. It was almost quiet, a long, dry whisper, like a deck of cards being handled by patient hands, like wind moving through tall grass at the end of summer. It lasted perhaps 1 second. It travelled up the cliff face and over the rim and through the morning air of the German position and into the ears of every man standing there. Then it was gone. What remained was silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of 60 men standing on a limestone ledge with 60 blades raised and their feet planted and their eyes looking straight up at one German major who had beaten back 3 Allied attacks and been told by everyone who examined the mathematics of this hill that his position was unbreakable. Brandt stood at the edge and looked down at those 60 blades in the early light. He was a man who had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front thinking about what soldiers can endure and where the boundary lies between courage and waste. He had walked that boundary until he knew it by feel, not by measuring it, but by living along it in every kind of weather. He turned and looked at his men. What he saw was something he would describe much later in a single sentence to a British officer who interviewed him after the war. He said, "They were good soldiers, but there are things that good soldiers should not be asked to do, and their faces told me I was about to ask." His men were not going to refuse a direct order. They would follow him into whatever came next, because that is what soldiers do. But their faces told him what their voices would never say. They knew the reports from North Africa. Every man in the German army who had served in the Mediterranean theatre knew those reports. 12 men. One night in Tunisia. 40 German soldiers. No shots fired. Brandt had read that specific file himself. He had read the final line of the investigating officer's report, written in the flat language of military documentation trying to contain something it did not fully understand. The assault was conducted entirely with bladed weapons. The defending force suffered 100% casualties. There was no indication that any member of the attacking force was wounded. He knew what happened when these men got inside concrete bunkers with their knives. He knew that his machine guns and his ranged fields of fire meant nothing, less than nothing, once 60 men with blades were inside walls that had been built to face only one direction. Brandt looked back down at the ledge. Stonepath had not moved. His knife was still raised. His face was still completely still, not angry, not triumphant, not performing anything for anyone, just present, just waiting, ready for whatever came next, and in no hurry about it. Behind him, 59 men stood in the same stillness. Brandt understood in that moment what he was actually looking at. Not 60 soldiers in a difficult tactical position, 60 men who had already decided. The decision had been made before they started climbing, made somewhere in the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico and Oklahoma, where these men had been shaped into what they were. They were not coming down. They were not surrendering. They were going to climb the last 50 feet, and they were going to use their knives, and some would die on the way up, and the ones who reached the top would finish what they had started. The only question remaining was how many people died before it ended. Major Ernst Brandt had not survived 3 years on the Eastern Front by being unable to answer hard questions quickly. At 7:12 in the morning on June 14, 1944, white cloth appeared from the first bunker, then the second, then the third and fourth simultaneously. German soldiers came out of their positions with their hands raised, blinking in the morning light, forming into a line on the flat ground at the top of the cliff, with the particular stunned look of men whose war has ended so suddenly their bodies have not yet received the message. 150 men, rifles slung muzzle down, hands at shoulder height. Stonepath led his 60 men up the final 50 feet of Devil's Tooth. He went first, as he had always gone first, climbing the last section in full morning light with the unhurried movements of a man who has been doing this his whole life. He pulled himself over the rim and stood upright on solid ground at the top of the position that had killed 2,800 men in 23 days. He looked at the bunkers and the machine gun nests and the carefully prepared fields of fire pointing down the southern slope. It would have killed 10,000 more. He looked at Ernst Brandt. Brandt stood apart from his men, hands at his sides, not raised. He was looking at Stonepath with an expression that contained something not quite respect, but in the neighborhood of it. The expression of a man who has just been shown something he did not know was possible, and is still, slowly, revising his understanding. Stonepath walked to him. They stood 6 feet apart. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Brandt said, in his careful English, "How many nights did it take you to learn that cliff?" Stonepath considered the question. 2, he said, plus 2 alone before that. Brandt nodded slowly. "I should have put more guards." "Yes," Stonepath said, "you should have." A long pause. Then Brandt said something quietly, almost to himself, something that Forsyth, standing 20 feet away, would later write down in a letter because he did not want to forget it. "I was not beaten by more men or more weapons," Brandt said. "I was beaten by a man who saw a cliff where I saw a wall." He looked at Stonepath directly. That is not a thing a man forgets. He was right. He never forgot it. After the war, Brandt returned to Germany, where he taught history and geography in a small town in Bavaria for 30 years. He was known among his students as a man who began every school year with the same lesson. Not about battles or campaigns or the movements of armies, but about the difference between a wall and a door. The wall, he would tell them, is the same object in both cases. What changes is the man looking at it. Within 72 hours of that morning on Devil's Tooth, 17 other German positions along the surrounding heights had surrendered without a fight. Some sent out white flags when they saw Stonepath's unit forming up below their hills. One German commander sent a written message before the Americans had even requested his surrender. It read, "We are aware of what occurred at position 973. We also have cliffs. We prefer to live." The road to Rome opened. Eli's stone path went home to Arizona in the fall of 1945. He did not talk about the war. He raised horses and grew corn and married a woman from his mother's village and had 4 children who grew up in the mountains the same way he had, learning to move through vertical rock before they learned most other things. His neighbors knew he had served. They did not know more than that. His Medal of Honor sat in a drawer in the back of his bedroom. Beside it, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a small rock, grey, smooth, the size of a man's palm. In the spring of 1987, Stonepath's oldest grandson found the rock while going through the house after the old man's death. He almost set it aside. Then he noticed the way it had been wrapped, carefully, with attention, the way you wrap something that matters but does not need to be displayed. Tucked inside the cloth was an envelope. The handwriting on the front was not his grandfather's. The postmark read, Italy, September 1945. Inside was a single piece of paper with a shorter note clipped to it. The shorter note was from Captain Wendell Forsyth, written in the direct, unadorned hand of a man who has spent years writing military reports. It said, "I went back to the cliff in August, climbed to the ledge in daylight with a rope and 2 rest stops. It took me 4 hours. This rock was sitting on the ledge when I got there. I picked it up because it was under your feet on the night you changed how this army thinks about what is possible. Keep it. Or don't. But know that I was standing at the bottom when you went up, and I watched the whole thing, and what I saw stays with me every day. Impossible is just a word used by people who quit too soon." The grandson sat down on the floor of his grandfather's bedroom and held the rock for a long time. He turned it over. It was just a rock, grey limestone. Nothing written on it, nothing that would tell you, if you did not know, that it had once sat on a ledge 280 feet up a cliff face in Italy, while 60 men lay around it in the dark and waited for dawn. He stood up and walked to the window. He set the rock on the sill where the morning light could reach it. It was the first time in 42 years that rock had seen the sun.